Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us now for the Real Talk, How College Students Are Actually Paying for College panel discussion. I'm Samantha Sang, a policy advisor at NextGen Policy, and it's been our pleasure to co-host this year's Free My Future Student Debt Summit with Young Invincibles. During our discussion today, we hope high school students, college students, and anyone in the policy or advocacy field interested in college affordability are tuning in, and because we're going to hear from current students on how they're cobbling funding together to finance their higher education, from financial aid and student loan experts giving their best advice. And this panel will hope to bridge the gap between what is being covered by financial aid and other sources and how students are doing, what they're doing to make up that difference. We have a wonderful group of panelists here with us today, so let's meet them now, and then we'll get into our discussion. First, I'd like to welcome Tariq Habash, Head of Investigations at the Student Borrower Protection Center. Tariq, do we have you with us?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sam. So I'm Tariq Habash. I'm the Head of Investigations at the Student Borrower Protection Center. For those that don't know who we are, we're a national nonprofit that works on advocating and doing research on student debt and fighting for borrowers across the country to help them really understand how we can unlock really being able to afford and access higher education and protecting students and student loan borrowers from predatory financial products in the student loan marketplace. In particular, my work really crosses at that predatory student financial products intersection. I look at the student loan marketplace, the breakdowns and failures of student loan companies, looking at private student loans, looking at the schools that really take advantage of students. And so trying to figure out how to best provide strong protections for those borrowers.
Great, thanks, Tariq. And we also have Andrew Nickens, Vice President of Legislative Affairs of the Student Senate for California Community Colleges. Andrew, are you there?
Yes, Sam, thanks for having me. My name is Andrew Nickens. I'm the Vice President of Legislative Affairs for the Student Senate for California Community Colleges. I'm a student at Folsom Lake College, a community college, and also at UC Davis. I recently just transferred. As Vice President of Legislative Affairs, I'm responsible for developing, setting, and executing the SSCCC's legislative priorities. In particular, this year, we're focused heavily on addressing basic needs and college affordability through Cal Grant reform and other means. And I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you about some challenges that community college students have and how we can address them. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew. And next we're going to go to Joshua Ochoa, Vice President of External Affairs of the Associated Students at San Francisco State University. Joshua?
Hello, and thank you for having me on this panel. Hi, everyone. My name is Joshua Ochoa. I am currently a senior political science major here at San Francisco State University. My position within student government here at SF State is the Vice President of External Affairs. And within this position, I really focus on addressing student needs, addressing student advocacy, and especially when it comes to voter registration. Just recently, we had a huge rollout for our voter registration campaign, really getting students involved, especially during COVID, which is especially difficult. But another part of it is working with our elected and appointed officials at the state, local, and federal government level, advocating on, creating a more affordable transit system for San Francisco, advocating on behalf of students for basic needs, and a lot of other things. So yeah, thank you so much for having me here.
All right, thank you, Joshua, for being with us. We also have Laura Zaboo Kubitz, Associated California Program Director at the Institute for College Access and Success, or otherwise TICAS. Laura, do we have you?
Yes. Well, it's an honor to be on this panel today with my great colleagues, and of course to get the opportunity to hear from the audience later. For those of you who may not be familiar with TICAS, we're an independent nonprofit organization focused on research, design, and advocacy for student-centered public policies that promote affordability, accountability, and equity in higher education. Both nationally and in states, including California, TICAS works to increase awareness and reduce the burden of student loan debt, improve access to available aid, strengthen need-based grant programs, and protect students, borrowers, and taxpayers. For over a decade, TICAS has led Californians for College Affordability, a coalition of 30 diverse organizations, including our terrific partners here at NextGen, the statewide student leadership groups, and many other civil rights, social justice, business, and higher ed advocacy groups that are united in strengthening need-based financial aid in California, in particular for our under-resourced and underrepresented students. We started this coalition in response to budget cuts proposed during the Great Recession, and over the years have successfully advocated for improvements to state aid, including the Cal Grant program, as well as led financial aid reform efforts. And most recently, we've been engaged in work to protect student resources during the ongoing pandemic and recession. Core to our work is hearing directly from students like you about your challenges and what can be done to address them. And I look forward to the conversation today.
Great. Welcome, Laura. And last but certainly not least, we have Lauren Valles, Fund the UC Campaign Vice Chair of the UC Student Association. Lauren?
Thank you so much, Sam, and hello, everyone. I, too, am so honored to be on today's panel. Like Sam said, my name is Lauren Valles, and I'm currently a third year at UCLA, and I also serve as the Fund the UC Campaign Vice Chair for the UC Student Association. UC Student Association, or UCSA, is the official voice of students from across the UC system of campuses, and it's our mission to advocate on behalf of current and future students at the University of California for accessibility, affordability, and the quality of our educational system. The long-term purpose of my campaign, specifically Fund the UC, is to find a sustainable long-term funding model for California higher education. And our goals for this year, elected by students across the system, are to double the Pell Grant and expand aid to undocumented students. So I'm really excited to chat with you all today and to learn from everyone on this panel. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lauren. And thank you all for being here today, especially for our student representatives who I know are juggling so much these days. So let's get into it. First, I would like to start with our students. Would you please share what your experience has been like to try to figure out how you would pay for college? You know, maybe what were some resources or people you relied on when you were first trying to figure out how to get there? And what sources of funding are you currently using? Are you using financial aid, scholarships, loans, credit cards? You know, what has it been like? So anyone can jump in here.
Sure, I can go first. So my story is interesting. I am from Orange County, California, so it's a very expensive area to live in. I also came from a pretty lower income family with just my single parent family, my mom and my brother. And, you know, just having that single income from my mom already made it very difficult to be able to, you know, figure out how we're paying for college, let alone just figure out how we're going to be able to kind of navigate my high school career, because that was, you know, right after the aftermath of the recession. And my mom is a public school teacher, so of course their teachers are not paid enough. And regardless of what their teaching level is. So kind of navigating that college experience was very difficult for my family. I'm right in that middle, like working class income of, you know, making too much to be able to get those grants through the Pell Grant or scholarships, but definitely not enough to be able for my family to cover that cost. So coming to college, I was basically running on loans. That's the only thing that I was able to get. I received no grants or scholarships coming into college. Luckily, the middle class scholarship has helped me a little bit along the way. But I did research on my loans right now, and I'm currently really sad to hear this number, but $63,000 in loans currently. 21 is my individual portion, with my mom covering the 41,000 for the additional portion. Most of that is housing. A lot of that is also other supportive resources that are covering my college experience. And I'm currently navigating how that is going to be a reality for me. How am I going to pay this off? How am I going to kind of schedule that? And to be honest, the systems that we have now really don't prepare us to figure out and navigate that journey on our own, because they really just kind of throw it on you and they're like, good luck. So trying to navigate that space, trying to be able to be an independent adult is very difficult when you have that $20,000 plus bill waiting for you the second you graduate. So I think, what we need to do is really address the systemic changes that need to happen to be able to support students and not leave them and their families, who are usually going through this the first time, really kind of survivalist instinct. We really need to build that institutional support to support our students, especially our first generation students.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Joshua. And fortunately, you're not alone. We know there's millions of other folks out there carrying student loan debt, and in California, it's nearly 4 million alone here. So you're in a large company. But hopefully, again, at this Free My Future Student Debt Summit here, there are plenty of resources to help navigate those systems. But also, Lauren, Andrew, do you want to be able to share here?
Definitely. I can go next. And thank you so much, Josh, for delivering such an empowering statement. And I completely agree with you that we really need to implement systems that protect our borrowers, that protect myself. I'm a borrower as well, in navigating the process of attending higher education. And so, I can speak to my experience. When I was admitted into college, I remember when I was a senior, I felt an overwhelming sense of joy and gratitude. But I also remember how quickly this sense of joy and gratitude was met with the crippling anxiety of, wondering how I was going to pay for college, coming up with the resources to be able to pursue higher ed. And so luckily for me, at my high school, I had a college and career counselor who was very invested in our scholarship process. And so I remember my senior year of high school and my spring semester, I spent every single day, probably 3 hours a day, applying to scholarships, got really good at writing those essays very quickly, and, spent a lot of time interviewing and trying to collect resources to attend college that way. And so at the end of the day, I was lucky enough to finance the first 2 years of my college education through scholarships. But, I'm totally relate to you, Josh, in being at that spot where, making enough so that I don't receive any grant aid, but, making too little, or excuse me, making enough so that I don't receive any grant aid, but making too little to where I'm not helped in other ways. And so really the process of attending college has come down to me to pursuing individual scholarships, but also student loans as well. And so currently right now I have about $15,000 out in student loans, in direct unsubsidized loans. And so that doesn't include the parent contribution that my mom also has out right now. So I completely empathize with what all of our borrowers are going through and trying to figure out how we're going to pay back these loans, especially in this time of the pandemic and such an uncertain economy, where the job market definitely isn't as strong as it's been in previous years. So excited to talk about that today and to find solutions as we move forward in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. And yeah, just as both of you have said, the other issue of parents taking out loans as well, to fill that gap, and the need to not just make sure students have the resources and information, as Joshua said, just kind of thrown at you, but to make sure that there's support throughout the years. Andrew, would you like to also share and jump in here?
Yes, definitely. My story is probably going to look a little bit different from Joshua and Lauren's. As a community college student, I was fortunate enough to, right out of high school, start attending community college. Well, actually, I wouldn't necessarily say fortunate. I nearly failed high school. And so community college was really my only option if I wanted to access higher education. But fortunate in the sense that as a result of the California College Promise, my tuition and fees were waived for the first 2 years, as long as I was a full-time student. But otherwise, community college students don't have access to the same level of aid, grant aid, that UC and CSU students do. I think the perception largely exists that, lots of community college students are traditional in the sense that they attend a community college while living with their parents, or that the costs aren't as great for them. And I was fortunate enough to stay with my parents to continue in school, but it's the non-tuition costs that really create an environment where, for a low-income student, it costs more to go to a community college than a CSU and UC because of that lack of grant aid. And in fact, it takes a low-income student working 30 hours a week to be able to afford community college because of that lack of aid. And now that I've transferred and moved on to UC Davis, I finally had to, figure out how to finance my education other than just through the promise. And I've taken out $29,000 in student loans to be able to attend UC Davis. But I think this issue is sometimes even worse in areas like the Inland Empire, where a number of colleges, community colleges, don't offer federal loans or even the California College Promise, and as a result, students have to borrow from third-party providers, often predatory, and really don't have any options available to them through their institution other than their tuition and fees being waived, which, as we know nowadays, is not where the majority of costs come from. And more often than not, the traditional student is the non-traditional student in community colleges that are older, over the age of 25, are working adults, and people who have to manage families sometimes as well too. So that's really a lot of what we see within the community college system.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for sharing that. I mean, it also depends on which, institution that you're at, that kind of shape what financial factors you're going to be facing. But, it is, and especially the non-tuition costs are a very good point to bring up here. We know that the idea of what going to college is perhaps a little different than what the reality is today. Those non-tuition costs really factor in here. And what your school has to offer definitely, I think, plays a role here. Like Andrew was saying, he was able to access that Promise program that does pay for the first 2 years of community college in California. But if you're in a different institution and different pathway, that may not be available to you. And so all of you kind of touched on this a little bit. I do just want to drill down so some finer details, and you can, be as direct as you want in this. It seems to me that, you all were able to access student loans. So, is it, what makes it hard to access the other financial aid pieces? Would you say it was relatively easier to just get into student loans, or, what were some of those major obstacles when you're trying to access each funding source?
Yeah, I mean, if I could start, I would say that while I was able to access loans, it was incredibly challenging to be able to find information about, Cal Grant. Which Cal Grant did I qualify for? How do I, get my GPA verified through my college? And even then, even if I got my GPA verified, does it still mean that I could actually make use of a Cal Grant? Besides a flyer that my college handled out in the counseling department with financial aid resources that weren't that I wasn't eligible for, I really had to kind of go and make my own way in terms of finding out other ways to finance my education, through the Cal Grant, through other scholarships or aid available to me.
And I'll add on too, I think, I shared earlier that a part of my story is that I was really lucky. I had a very on top of it high school counselor who was really invested in myself and all of my peers' scholarship process or application processes. But that definitely isn't a role and an occupation that's mirrored across all California public schools, I would argue. And I was very lucky that I had someone who pushed me and motivated me to apply to alternative sources of funding, but many people don't have that currently right now. And I'll also add too, at UCLA, I also serve as a Bruin ambassador. So I go out on behalf of UCLA undergraduate admissions and try to, inspire students in underrepresented areas to pursue college. And the lack of resources in various places, even I've seen across LA, of students not knowing how to fill out FAFSA, of having parents who, have that language barrier, of not knowing how to seek out those other resources. And like Andrew was saying, having to make their way. It's disheartening to see the disparity across the state. And so I hope going forward that, we can implement better forms of institutional education at a young age so that students and their families are well equipped to navigate this process.
Yeah, and just to add on to both what Andrew and Lauren said, I think, at least from my experience, when I went from high school, it was a relatively high income area. So a lot of the people who were preparing us for college didn't actually talk about those resources as much because it was kind of assumed that, because of the area we were living in, that everyone was able to fund themselves through college. So being someone who was lower income compared to my community, it was much more difficult for me to navigate those resources because they weren't as presented as a lot of other places were. And then, of course, moving to San Francisco, as everyone knows, is one of the most expensive cities, not only in the country, but in the world. So just to double down on what Andrew was saying, a lot of what is ignored, especially in these financial aid packages, is the non-tuition costs. Just for clarification, about $40,000 of my $63,000 in loans is just for housing. The housing at SS State is incredibly expensive. And it's about market rate when it comes to comparing student housing on campus to off-campus housing. So it's about building those institutional clarifications and making sure that we're funding students for the non-tuition parts as well as the tuition parts. Because now we're seeing this sort of shift in cost. A lot of our parents and grandparents are like, hey, like go to work and you can pay it off on your own. But at the same time, there's lack of acknowledgement that the cost of living continues to rise, while a lot of these economic opportunities for students are pretty much remaining stagnant. And we're seeing the same thing when it comes to paying our students what they're worth. A lot of the times, our internships are very much emphasized throughout our college education, while a vast majority of them are unpaid. So we're seeing a lot of these opportunities not really happening for students, and we need to make sure that we're actually pushing students forward. We're giving them the space that they can to grow, because a lot of what's being said by either government officials or by our parents or grandparents is that you can do it on your own, but that's just not the reality for so many people, especially due to a lot of the college students that we're seeing today, which are people of color, lower income, people who don't have that support back at home to be able to get themselves through college. So it's just, we have to rethink, I think, the way we see these assistive services and systems to be able to support the people who don't have that support already coming into college.
Absolutely. Very powerful. Thank you, Joshua, and for driving that home. And a lot of that definitely resonates with me. I'm a first generation college student myself, and I frankly can't remember how it kind of happened for myself. You get the information, you kind of toggle through. My parents didn't speak English that very, well. So it was mostly me trying to figure out how I was going to get there. So absolutely this, that it reminds me of me, and I'm a little frustrated, and this is why we're in this work here together, that I'm still hearing those stories today. So hopefully we will get towards some of that solution points here. So I'd like to turn to you now, Laura, if we could. TICA's, your organization, has done a lot of research and work with students around financial aid reform, student debt, and in general, looking at all the different costs of college facing students today. And so can you tell us a little bit about that work and maybe what some top line advice is to students balancing so many different sources of funding just to go to college?
Sure. In alignment with what the students have already helpfully shared on this panel, we at TICAS focus on total college costs and as financial aid as a critical tool for both college access and success. So as I'm sure everyone here knows well, students need resources not only to cover tuition to step foot in the classroom, but also to be successful students by being able to pay for required textbooks and materials, nourishing meals, safe housing, to be able to afford time in class and studying rather than working. A couple of years ago, we did a report on the verge, costs and trade-offs facing community college students, and we documented the incredibly difficult choices students must make when grant aid falls short, choices that students should never have to make, such as whether to buy a textbook or have enough groceries for the month. And these challenges and very real basic needs struggles have only been exacerbated affected by by COVID-19, and in particular for low-income students and students of color. We first and foremost, we want to make sure that students are accessing robust need-based grant aid, and we have been involved in efforts in recent years to reform the state Cal Grant program. Of course, that is now temporarily on hold, but there still are many low to no cost creative ways that we can improve college affordability. I'll get back to that in a second. But we do also want to make sure that when affordability gaps exist, and that when there is unfortunately at this point not enough grant aid to cover total college costs, that students have access to the safest form of borrowing, which is federal loans, and the protections that come with them, like income-driven repayment plans and loan forgiveness, as Andrew had mentioned. And then again, back to, a central focus of our work is strengthening need-based aid. As the crisis continues, we at TICAS remain committed to continuing this work. And so one example of how you could improve college affordability in a no-cost way is to make sure that students are getting paid competitive Cal Grants at the beginning of the year when aid is most important. And so right now awards are offered, and then if students don't take them, they're recycled. And so several thousand awards don't actually end up getting paid out until the end of the year. So there are ways we can work with the legislature to tighten existing programs to make sure that we're taking full advantage of the aid that's out there. And, I would say there's also ways that we can be improving student access to financial resources beyond state aid, like CalFresh is very important, and also leveraging system efficiencies and reforms to lower the cost of a degree, especially around developmental education, and, utilizing and creating a statewide student loan data system so we can better understand our student needs. So all of that to say, I always learn so much when I hear directly from the students about what the challenges are you're facing, and like working together to craft policy solutions to address them, making sure that policymakers are aware of the challenges you're facing. So reaching out to groups like NextGen and TICAS and the statewide student leadership groups to partner with all of us. And, also just reaching out to the student support services on your campuses to find out about CalFresh, other government benefits, and any aid that you may be eligible for.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, that's, great to hear, because those are all very important topics to be tackling. And of course, happy to our partnership and working on some of those issues as well. And I think what we've been hearing today too here also, that the financial aid systems and the systems that we have right now for students are very, they make really large assumptions, I think. To me, it seems like it's assuming you have parents that are readily available to you, two parents, you have a home that you are in, a steady home that you go to every night, perhaps. So yeah, again, I think there's a lot of assumptions in these systems that we have outlined. So maybe, and you already touched on this a little bit, but maybe what's one or two of the top, if you had a magic wand to fix the higher education systems, what would be your recommendations to streamline some of these institutional processes?
Yeah. First, and I think someone already said this on the panel, that sort of that the non-traditional student has now become the traditional student, and making sure that all who want to attend college for the first time or going back have the resources they need to support them. So right now, if you are a recent high school graduate and you meet basic eligibility criteria, you are entitled to a Cal Grant and you will get one. But if you are even just 1 year out of high school graduation, you could be as young as 19, although of course we know there's many adults who are going back to school, you have to compete for a very limited number of competitive Cal Grants. And so getting rid of the age barrier. I know that there's a lot of great work being done around that with Cal Grant modernization being led by the California Student Aid Commission, and making sure that essentially if you meet the requirements, it doesn't matter how young, how old you are, you should be able to get a Cal Grant. And then the second big piece is the amount of the Cal Grant that covers non-tuition costs. As many of us have been talking about, we know that the majority of college costs across schools is a non-tuition cost, yet the Access Award portion of the Cal Grant that covers those costs is less than a quarter its original value. It would be worth over $7,000 today had it kept pace with inflation, and it's less than $2,000. And with our students facing over $20,000 in non-tuition costs, we need a much more robust award to cover books, food, housing, transportation, etc.
Wonderful. Yes, we would definitely like to see that happen very soon for our college students, but also want to open up the floor here too. If you had this magic wand, what could we change to help help students now?
I'd love to hop in here. I think if I have a magic wand to really help students, I think the thing that I would do is ensure that if the formula that's used to determine what your and your family's contribution should be, if that formula actually reflected the aid that you were getting. So if your expected contribution towards your education was 0, then that would actually be the expected amount that you had to pay. Unfortunately, the formula doesn't really work like that, and so many students currently are still getting this, what is known as an unmet need, where they have a need for additional aid. Unfortunately, there's just not enough money there to be able to cover those costs, and so they have to eat that in loans. And if I had a wand, I would want to do that.
And just to hop on right after that, I so much agree with that, what you just said. Definitely. If I remember looking at my expected family contribution, and I was fully bamboozled by the fact that it was like $15,000, and I was like, we cannot afford that. That is something that, like, you know, we could maybe a few thousand, but absolutely incorrect in the formula of that contribution. If I definitely had a magic wand, I definitely wish I did, would be to do 2 things. The first one's kind of related, is to actually adjust the cost of attendance. I believe there was one legislative bill that was in the California State Legislature, which would be to fix that cost of attendance. I don't think it went out of committee. Definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but that's something that, you know, at SF State is very inaccurate. Right now, it's about $29,000 for 1 year of attendance, and that is something that is severely undercutting the reality of how expensive it is to live in the Bay Area. You know, about 60-70% of our students are commuter students, and that number is growing because they can't afford to live in San Francisco. So they need to account for that in the expected cost of attendance. The other thing that I really want to hit home, and it's actually the reason why I got into student government and why I really want to do political science and get into, you know, public service, is addressing the basic needs of students. So much of what we do in college is fully dependent on how we're able to be supported with just our basic needs. In San Francisco, I believe we are one of the best examples and the saddest examples when it comes to basic needs statistics. Almost 20% of our students, and this is pre-COVID, were experienced housing insecurity. Almost 50% of our students experienced food insecurity, and those numbers have only grown during COVID, as well as accessibility to those resources. So if we can't find a solid place to find our next meal, if we can't find a place to eat at the end of the night, everything else on top of that is going to be affected. And I think that, you know, we don't have the adequate resources and services when it comes to basic needs that we should be having, because if there is at least one student who does not have a home or does not have a place to eat, then it's obviously that the system is not working correctly and that we need to adjust it. But basic needs is really the main issue that really pushed me into that. And as someone who has experienced, you know, homelessness and food insecurity, I am even more driven to do that, to make sure that no other student has to experience that problem. So it's very clear that, you know, the system is not working and we need to address it.
And I'll go ahead and hop in right after Joshua's extremely powerful testimonial. You know, in talking about basic needs and basic needs shortages, if I had a magic wand and I could go in and change something about financial aid right now, it would be to elevate what is this year's Fund the UC campaign goal, which is doubling the Pell Grant. And so currently students continue to lack adequate food and housing security, as well as access to childcare, technology, and other resources in pursuing higher ed. And with increased federal investment in the Pell Grant program, many of these needs can be met. And additionally, in talking about, you know, borrowing and debt, as we've been speaking today, doubling the Pell Grant has the power to minimize and even eliminate student debt, because the current Pell Maximum Award, as we know, doesn't meet students' needs right now. But if it was doubled, students could meet funding gaps that they currently satisfy by taking out loans, by utilizing those Pell Grant resources. And I can talk about this a little bit more later, but that's definitely my wish list for if I had a magic wand.
Yeah, if I could go quickly, my magic wand would be correcting I think a decades-long misconception about community colleges, in that the main costs that a student incurs, a community college student incurs, is tuition and fees, when those are already waived. I think would be the legislature finally recognizing that it's not tuition and fees that are the problem for community college students, but non-tuition costs, and that we need a comprehensive and holistic financial aid system which addresses not only financial need in terms of what does it actually take to pay for my classes, but what does it take to pay for my food? What does it take to pay for my housing? That's something that just doesn't exist for community college students. The assumption is that that's already taken care of, and so many of our low-income students have to pay the price of that misconception every day.
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts on this. Any ledge staff and policymakers listening, you got some good ideas here. It's hard to hear how much the basic needs, really do impact the academic success of students. And that, at least here, you all talked about, a lot of that does get covered by student loans, not covered by financial aid, where you don't need to pay that back. Tariq, if we could turn to you then and deep dive into this topic of student loans. What can the government, higher education systems do to help ensure students are getting useful, practical, easily understandable information about taking out loans? Some of our friends here might also have heard me say, I think we should stop talking about student loans as financial aid. That is not free money. It is something that will live with you for a long time. So, Tariq, what are some of your top line advice for students when they are considering taking out student loans?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I just want to build on a couple of the things that we've heard as well, because I think everyone has kind of touched a little bit on this, but particularly I think when you are thinking about a financial aid package, just kind of building on what you're saying, Sam, making sure that we actually understand what is making up that financial aid package and what is truly aid in the way that like most of us think about it intuitively. Like, what are grants? What is something that is not something that is expected to be paid back at some point? And what is a loan? What is an extension of credit that is something that might be necessary and might be helpful in certain circumstances, but could also potentially be harmful? And I think really recognizing the difference between those two things is really, really important for students and families as they're trying to figure out and navigate the system. And then separately, when we are thinking about loans and extensions of credit, understanding the differences between what those are. There are so many different types of financial products out there that are designed to help students finance their educations. Even when it comes to federal student loans, you have subsidized and unsubsidized loans, and understanding what that actually means is really important to really figuring out what your future financial liability is going to be, and understanding and assessing what that's going to mean for the financial decisions that you make now and then years down the road, and then figuring out what that looks like compared to private student loans and other types of financial products that you might use. I know you had mentioned, for example, credit cards are some things that unfortunately so many people rely on. Credit cards are one of the highest cost products that you can rely on because they are this form of revolving credit that accrues fairly high interest rates. And it is not really a product that people should be relying on when there are other options like federal student loans. I think Laura hit this right on the head. exhaust your federal student loans first. Everyone should be telling you that. And if they're not telling you that, they are telling you something wrong, because the reality is there are so many more protections that come with federal student loans than other types of financial products, including private student loans. And if you look at the market right now, the reality is interest rates are low. That does not mean that they're a better deal on the back end than federal student loans. And the reason for that is sometimes those rates are variable. The reason for that is they require cosigners. The reason for that is they don't have flexible repayment options. You can exhaust your deferments and forbearances much faster. And there are just fewer protections. And in a world where we've seen tens of millions of people lose their jobs over the last 9 months because of a global pandemic, we can't always rely on certainty in whatever is happening in our lives. And so making assumptions that are going to affect your financial decision-making for years, and in some cases with student loans, decades to come, is really, really important to ensure that you are being afforded the strongest protections. So I think clear communication about all of those things, making sure that borrowers know where their strongest protections really exist, and recognizing that if you do exhaust your federal student loans and you still have some unmet need, really being able to compare what those options are, talking to your financial aid counselors, finding out what those different options are, and then being aware that there are some predatory products out there in the market. When a company is advertising that they don't do a credit check and that you will be guaranteed financing, and or if they say, you know what, this is not a loan, this isn't credit, this is just something that is a new product that is just so innovative that you don't have to think about this as a loan, like those are red flags. You should be concerned when someone is saying this is not debt, this is not credit. And you should be concerned that someone is saying you don't need a cosigner and we don't need to do a background check on your credit, because more than likely the rates that they are charging you are astronomical and extremely predatory. And you should just be aware that those products exist. If you are adamant about going to the private market, be aware that there are refinance options down the road that you might consider. I just got an email 15 minutes before this panel started about refinancing my federal student loans. My personal decision is not to do that, because it took me years to even see the principal on my student loans start to go down, but the protections that I'm afforded with income-driven repayment options, with public service loan forgiveness, the fact that I work at a nonprofit, for me, those are such important protections that I would never entertain the idea of the private market. Now, that's not the calculation that everyone uses, but for me, that makes the most sense. And I feel much more comfortable knowing that I will always have the federal protections that I'm afforded for as long as I have these federal loans.
Thanks, Tariq. That's a lot. I will definitely just say from my own experience, that, anyone feel free to jump in here, but I didn't know about any of that when I was going to college. I just learned about all this by working in this field in the last couple of years. So, well beyond my college years, which I think is just kind of ridiculous.
I'd love to just throw in real quick. Something that almost nobody knows, and I didn't know this when I was in college, I only learned this from working in this space, is that so I talked about the expected family contribution a little bit, and how there's a formula that determines what your family, what you are going to be able to pay towards your student loans, and how they determine how much financial aid you get, need-based aid, loans, et cetera, et cetera. You can actually appeal that calculation. You can go to your financial aid office and you can tell them, I don't think this is right. I don't think that I can actually afford $20,000 a year. This is why I can't afford it. This is my family's income. Or I don't have financial support from my parents. You shouldn't be considering their income. I've been living on my own away from them for 3 years. You shouldn't factor all of that stuff in. Can you please reassess what my actual ability to pay here is? And they're supposed to help you with that. That is written in that, that is a protection that you have, but people just don't know. And so explaining that students have those options, that they can effectively negotiate with the school to get a little bit more support, that there are community-based organizations out there that work with public benefits program to help you access additional financial resources that you didn't know that you might be eligible for. Those are really critical things. It's not just about should I take out loans or not? It's about knowing that there are more resources out there, that some schools have emergency grant programs if your car breaks down to be able to help you afford that. And there are really great organizations out there like the Center for Law and Social Policy and the Hope Center for College that have done a ton of research on food insecurity and homelessness, and bringing those issues to the forefront of higher education policy has been critical in moving the conversation forward about recognizing that the costs that students are facing today are not just tuition related, that they expand so much beyond that. And so I think everything that Joshua and Andrew and Lauren and Laura have been saying is 100% right. We need to be thinking about the system holistically. We need to be addressing the systemic failures that focusing on traditional aged 18 to 22-year-old students who have two parents who are working, who are able to support them. We need to be thinking beyond that as we are redefining higher education affordability in this space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That sounds good to me. And I do want to get here some practical questions that have been coming up throughout the summit too. I think Joshua, unfortunately, you may be the one here that's closest to this, thinking about repayment. And I know that a lot of current college students this year, especially given COVID-19, there's been a lot of, mixed messaging or maybe just misinformation or just confusing information out there because the federal government has taken actions to give repayment relief. So if you're going to graduate, you do get that 3-month grace period. But so then, college students have been asking, so do I get that relief? Does that apply to me now, or when does that happen? What should I be doing? So can you just quickly answer that for some of our college students maybe wondering what's happening right now?
Yes. So I do want to add one thing about something that Tariq, you mentioned, was the fact that we don't differentiate and describe what subsidized versus unsubsidized loans are. For example, myself, I did not know what they were until about the second year of my college education. And a result of that is, right now my loans are 50-50. I've been building interest since I've been in college for 3 years. So now 10% of everything that I owe is now interest. So it's like, we're not teaching students that. And we really need to focus on, kind of like what we've all been saying is, looking at the system. It is not meant for, students to be able to survive this system without debt. And I think, I unfortunately follow a sad Twitter that posts every single day the updates every single day of the student loan or the student loan debt in the United States. And it's like approaching $1.8 trillion. And it's, it's like, I don't know how the system expects us to be able to survive that system without coming out, economically ruined. Because it's not, it's clear that that's not a survivable system. And I think, kind of just to go back to what we were saying before, is how do we address the system with like the different proposals that we have? It's just, again, I can't emphasize enough like what Andrew said earlier. It's just, it's about focusing on the student that is untraditional. This is not, it's me paying this. It's not my parents. It's a lot of it is us. Another thing I wanted to add is something that's not really looked at is the fact that, our parents sometimes do claim us as dependents past the age of 18. And that also affects us when we're trying to find jobs, when we're trying to be able to pay our taxes. When we're claimed as dependents, a lot of that is then placed onto us because then we're expected to pay more in taxes. So that leaves us even more in debt, even more unable to be able to pay off the, that $1.8 trillion.
And, I'll just add, one thing to piggyback on that. and also all the great comments everyone has made and Tariq just made. You can ask when you make your appeal to the financial aid office, you can ask for a dependency override. Now it's at the discretion of the financial aid administrators whether or not they will actually grant it. But there is a specific dependency override to that issue. And if the key word when you make your appeal is say you want a professional judgment or a PJ. So that's just some language around that you can use when you reach out to your financial aid office. I also just wanted to add one other thing too, which is to another great comment that Tariq had made, is just to really very carefully go over the terms of any kind of financial resources that are made available to you. And if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. One that I have some real concerns about that's newer is called income share agreements. On the surface, they can seem like they're pretty friendly, but they're just another type of loan. So I bring that up as an example of making sure you go over the terms, and they can be complicated. Lord knows I have a hard time understanding them myself. So feel free to reach out to, people in the field, people on this call, and you can probably get connected with someone who can help walk you through it.
We do want to make sure we get that answer specifically to if you're a college student and what's going on with COVID right now. Tariq, do you want to maybe explain for those either recently graduating or they're recently graduated or about to graduate?
Yeah, for sure. Right now, there are currently a lot of people who are about to graduate or have just recently graduated, and they're entering a job market that just does not look the same as it did a year ago. We were seeing extremely low unemployment rates below 4%. Now we are like around more than double and some months triple that rate. We've seen more than 20 million Americans lose their jobs. And what that means is that we are not seeing that income come in, and we're trying to figure out how we can navigate. For the last 8.5 months, there's been a payment pause on federal student loans. But not all federal student loans have a payment pause where you are not responsible for making payments. There's also a 0% interest through December 31st on all of those loans. So the loans that applies to are direct loans and federally held FFEL loans, which are federal family education loans. And so those are older loans that were originated before 2011 that were originated by banks, but guaranteed by the federal government. To know whether your loan is a FFEL loan or a federally held FFEL loan or a commercially held FFEL loan, you really actually have to just go into the system and type in into the student loan website, like what your information is, and be able to look at that. But if you have a Perkins loan as well, the payment pause doesn't actually apply to those. So for all current and recent graduates, you really have to navigate whether all of your loans are direct loans. If you have private loans, figuring out what the repayment obligation is going to be for you, and really figure out how you need to handle that best. Again, like I said, the payment pause ends on December 31st. So that kicks back on in the new year, and figuring out what that's going to look like. There's a likelihood that there will be some sort of fiasco, because we're talking about 35 million people's student loan payments getting turned on. Again, not the entire 45 million, but a large majority of those student loan borrowers are going to see their student loan payments turn back on, and the handful of companies that are managing those loans are going to have to figure out how to manage that process. I think fortunately, the expectation is that the president-elect has made it clear that student loans are a top priority for him. And I think on day one, or very, very early into the next administration, we are going to expect to see some policies to address the student debt crisis, and presumably addressing the lapse in that payment pause is going to be at the top of the list.
Thanks for that information, Tariq. Yeah, I mean, we're all, I think, anxiously waiting to see what's going to happen come the next administration. Well, before we move on, I just, okay, so, I think checking the time actually. Let's make sure we're almost there. So I want to get to everyone here. If you could just give us, your last takeaway message for everyone listening right now. Maybe what is something you wish you knew when you were applying for college, or what do you hope to see come January and in the new future for all students? So let's just go down the line here. We'll start with Laura.
Great. So it's so hard to pick just one, but so maybe I'll pick like two. Again, really great points made about federal student loans. As I was saying earlier, ideally we want to make sure that students have as much grant aid as possible so that you don't need to borrow in the first place. But I do think it's important to know that if you do have to borrow, federal loans are the safest. And, it's obviously an individual choice, but there can be some benefits that come without working too much and freeing up that time for studying. So just trying to keep in mind, just sort of balancing and loans to fill the gap if you have an affordability gap. And also to be sure to reach out to the student support services on your campus to learn about all of the resources that are available. There's, both in terms of financial aid and emergency aid and other types of resources that you may not be aware of, and also what you can do to access government benefits like CalFresh.
Thanks, Laura. And let's go to Lauren.
I think my parting words for today would be that closing gaps and ensuring debt-free college is a task that requires multi-step policy solutions. We've addressed lots of them today, but just to hammer home a few, I know us at the UC level, we need to adopt need-conscious self-help expectations. And the state of California needs to fix financial aid and reform Cal Grant. And at the federal level, like I mentioned, we need to double the Pell Grant. And so what's really important to me about doubling the Pell Grant is that it affects not only those students who currently receive it, but opens up opportunities for the state and its schools to maximize and more effectively leverage institutional and state aid to ensure that students across all income brackets, don't have to be at a point where they have to take out loans to fill those funding gaps for their education. And, I know, Sam, you mentioned what we want to see in the future, what we want to see come January. In January with this administration, I would hope that they can reaffirm a federal investment in the students of this nation, in our socioeconomic mobility and in our future. And they can do that by doubling the Pell Grant. So that's what I hope to see.
Thank you, Lauren. Andrew.
I just want to say that college financing doesn't happen when you're ready to go to college. It happens much sooner than that. As soon as you're able, as soon as you're ready to start looking at, where you want to go to college, you need to have those financial, literacy conversations with your parents. I think one of my mistakes is sometimes just waiting for my parents to have a conversation with me instead of being proactive and creating a learning experience with your family and talking about a healthy way about finances with your parents, if you have them, to talk about how you're going to finance college, because it's something that can't simply be left off to the last minute. Waiting to submit an essay at midnight is much different than possibly saddling, tens of thousands of dollars that will stay with you for a large part of your life, as unfortunately Joshua might have to deal with it. I guess so will I eventually too. So just things to keep in mind is start that planning early and often.
So true, Andrew. So true. All right, let's go to Joshua.
Yes, thank you, Andrew, for that sad shout out. I'm definitely not looking forward to the next 20 years of paying off my loans. But I would say, for the future administration coming in, I really do believe that, young people are not an expendable group. Young people are continuously, really at the forefront of a lot of the new battles that we're going to face for the next few years. So I think that student loan debt is something that I think this administration really needs to address head on as soon as possible, to really be able to, once we get out of the pandemic, really unleash our abilities to get involved, to start our careers and to start our lives. But one thing I will say about, one thing you really need to do, especially when you get to college, is please don't be afraid to ask questions. The chances you talk to someone, either with whether it's an administration, financial aid, or student government, definitely one of the parts that I enjoy about student government is being able to kind of channel people the right direction. Because chances are you're going to ask a question that someone can lead you, maybe if they don't know, to the right place to someone that does know. Really be in contact with the financial aid office of the college that you do go to. Don't be afraid to show up there like every other day or every day to ask questions. They're there to help you. And I think one thing that you find out once you do get to college is, a lot of those things that we're scared of when we are arriving on campus, you really kind of break down that anxiety once you talk to people. And because most of the people there, if not every single person, is there to help you and make sure that you are having the really full experience that you want to have as a student. And you just got to utilize those resources because most of the time they are going to be there, especially for those who need it most. So I just really emphasize asking questions. Don't be afraid to stand up and be like, why isn't this the way it is? Or why is this the way it is? And where can I get some help? And I think once you get there, we'll fix the rest of the things once we start to empower our young people. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. Yes, absolutely. I mean, college students, you are your own advocates, from day one and onwards. And I'm great to see we have some strong advocate voices here. All right, and Tariq?
I think we've heard some really great big thinking solutions here. I'm going to add one more to the mix on top of doubling Pell, on top of debt-free college. And I think we've all kind of been talking around this issue that the current system is not working for Americans. We have 45 million Americans owing $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. That doesn't even make up all of the different avenues that people use to pay for the cost of education. We're only talking about the traditional federal student loans and private student loan markets. We're not talking about any of these other types of products like credit cards and shadow debt that really kind of pervade this entire system. So I think one thing that we really need to critically think about is pushing relief for borrowers across the country. It's something that the president-elect has already committed to do. And it's something that I think there's a significant amount of legal analysis that suggests that he doesn't need Congress to be able to cancel student loan debt broadly for Americans. I think there are separately a number of existing programs in the law that provide opportunities for relief for borrowers. Public service loan forgiveness is one of them. Closed school discharge is another. Total and permanent disability is another. Borrower defense for borrowers who have been defrauded by predatory schools. All of these programs have not fully been utilized to their full extent. And I think a new administration coming in and using those existing protections to provide relief for millions of Americans is a really critical first step. And then I think just one other piece, I think over the last 4 years, we haven't really seen significant oversight and accountability in the student loan system and in higher education broadly. And I think one really critical thing that needs to happen is really reining in the predatory practices and holding predatory companies, both schools and financial institutions, accountable for those practices.
Thank you, Tariq. And yeah, I will also plug in, hopefully folks who tuned in earlier in the summit, AB 376, the Student Borrower Bill of Rights here in California did pass. So just like Tariq was saying, here in California, at least, Joshua and others who will soon be prepaying, moving forward, there will be a lot of more supportive tools in the shed, so to speak, for you to navigate repayment. So thank you all so much for sharing your story here today and your expertise. I think talking about finances is very personal, but as our summit hopefully has demonstrated, there is a power and reassurance to hearing from others about the universality of the financial issues that, pretty much all of us are facing. And so we are a little bit over time today, so I'd like to thank all of our panelists again for joining us and sharing their experiences and best advice. Thank you to all the students and everyone tuning in. Hopefully our discussion today brought more light to all the financial factors that students are juggling. And so students, know that you're not alone. And for others listening, hope you look into supporting efforts to address college affordability and check out the hashtag cancel student debt conversations happening around social media. And please join us next for our last and final event of the 2020 Free My Future Student Debt Summit. It's going to be a student debt workshop geared towards current college students starting at 5 p.m. Pacific time today. And you can still register. So tell all of your friends, all your college students in your life to go to nextgenpolicy.org/freemyfuture. Thank you, and I hope to see you there.